everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Welcome back to our walk through Romans 13, 1 through 7, on the role of the Christian in government. This is part 5, I believe. And today I'm going to address verse 1. Probably should have done that one earlier, but for whatever reason I just kind of liked how this order went. But as far as just governments and political powers of the world go, we can be very dogmatic in saying that there's not one single example that would seem to contradict what Romans 13:1 right here is saying in all the Bible. Every single authority, political authority, governmental authority on planet Earth that we see established in the Bible, there's nothing that would contradict every single one of them coming from God, and there are many, many, many things that would support that all of them came from God. And so I'll let you do whatever you will with that information. But just sort of some quick thoughts on providence. Providence comes from two Latin words. Pro means before or ahead of time, and videns or video, it's where we get the word video. It means to see. And so literally providence means to see ahead of time, the God who sees. And this was, I read a lot of old stuff, 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, 18th century. Everybody believed in the providence of God, every single person. Even in the, on the east coast of the United States, we have a city called Providence, Rhode Island. That's where it comes from. That's where the name comes from. And that was something that was just a presupposition. Everybody believed in the providence of God. Today we don't. In fact, there's entire segments of Christian academia called open theists that actually do not believe that God knows all of the future. And that's a whole other subject altogether. But the providence of God is all authority from God, like as verse 1 in Romans here seems to say, and that seems to be true without exception over and over again all through the Bible. Just a few examples that I came up with in 1 Kings chapter 12. We're here at the end of Solomon's reign. Remember, Saul was the first king. People demanded a king. He didn't turn out to be, he didn't meet any of their expectations hardly at all. And then David comes along, and David was a great king, man after God's own heart, wrote so many of the Psalms. He had a son named Solomon. Solomon takes over the kingdom with, in great economic situations, political situations, geomilitaristic situations, and Solomon is extremely wise, but actually has wisdom given to him by God in a way that no other human ever had. He writes most of Proverbs, but he was an idolater and did all sorts of terrible things, and he did not end well. And the whole thing is falling apart at his death, and he has two sons that and there ends up being infighting and a civil war. But right at the end of his reign, Rehoboam's about ready to take over as king, and all the old guys, the old dudes, are advising him. He's sort of wanting to know what to do, and they're all telling him to be merciful. Be merciful, be easy on the people. Don't overburden them with taxes and stuff, and they will serve you, and they will love you, and things will go good. And the young people, all the young hotshots tell him, no, you need to oppress this people and show them who's boss. And he listens to the young guys, and he does, and that's sort of what led to the Civil War. But it says in 1 Kings 12:15, so the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord. So you see, even though there's it's a bad situation, and bad is going from bad to worse, but God is saying, I did that. If we think about it, what's the one ruler in the last 6,000 years, of human history that in the most heinous way did not reward good behavior, but rather gave good behavior bad? Remember there in Romans 13 we see that The whole point of government, verses 3 and 4 say, is to reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. Well, what's the one guy that did the worst job of that ever? Well, you'd have to say Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea at the time the New Testament was written, or at least the time that we see the whole apostolic era being played out. He has this person brought to him, Jesus, right? The only perfect human being that's ever lived, never done anything wrong in any way, shape, or form, and he ends up having him beat and killed and tortured. Hard to say that anybody's done anything more heinous as far as governing authorities go. And at one point in time, he's trying to get Jesus to talk to him. Jesus doesn't want to, and he says, "Don't you know that I have authority to kill you? Don't you know that I have the power to crucify you?" And Jesus looks at him and says, "You have no authority except that it was given you from heaven." And so we see that God is the one. God is the one that caused the events that led up to the cross to happen. Acts chapter 4 says that it was predestined. God predestined it before the foundation of the world. That God did that. And ultimately, I mentioned this in another video, but if you don't have a category for Romans chapter 13, then you don't have a category for the gospel. Because, here we have an innocent person who is submitting to the governing authorities just like he's supposed to. Jesus, he didn't fight back. He laid down his life. He went like a sheep before her shearers is silent, so I did not open my mouth. He was a model of submission. Even when the government was not rewarding good behavior, he was a perfect model for us. In fact, Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, I think it's around verse 19, when he kind of says some similar things as Romans 13 does, he actually goes to that passage about how, look, when Jesus submitted to the governing authorities, this is what you're supposed to do. This is what it's supposed to look like. And and so ultimately, if you don't have a category for this, you don't have a category for the gospel, because this is how the gospel took place. You have an innocent person submitting to the government, a bad government, but it's ordained by God. All authority comes from God. There's no exception. And the bad authority uses that authority to punish the person that's submitting to it. That's how the whole gospel played out. That's how God used it. We see this over and over again. Daniel chapter 2 verse 21 says that God claims that I'm the one that set up. I set up and I remove kings. In another place, and I believe it's Proverbs, he talks about how the king's heart is in my hand. I can steer him over here. I can steer him over there. Whatever I want him to do, he's my servant. In fact, that's one of the words that Romans 13 uses. He's my servant to do whatever I want. And so God's will for the world today is that it be governed by civil authorities. And his authority is going to be exercised by good authorities and bad authorities. I skipped over a lot of stuff that I have here, but Nebuchadnezzar, the awful king of Babylon, that was just brutal person, and killed so many people. God says, I set him up. I raised him up. In fact, in one place he calls him my anointed. Says the same thing about the king of Persia. Same exact thing. And God sets up rulers and God removes rulers, and they do things for his purposes. And his authority will be exercised in this world by governmental authorities, both good and bad, until the end of the age. And that's just how it is. We cannot be conformed to this world. Romans 12:1 told us that. And that's going to immediately put us at odds with the world. We're on a collision course with worldly governments because of that. The governing authorities will persecute us. We're promised that. But we're to lead personal lives marked by mercy. That's what chapter 12 of Romans is all about. They're God's chosen instruments to govern us. We're to submit to them, not just because they bear the sword, not just because they can punish us if we don't, but for conscience sake, for God's sake, because it is Christian worship is what this passage is teaching. It is Christian worship to submit to the government. And we're to honor God by honoring Caesar. I just thought of this passage, but this is in the middle of Paul's famous sermon on Mars Hill, Acts chapter 17. He explains God's purpose in government. in the middle of that great sermon, he says, "From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us." What is he saying here? What is Paul teaching us about God? God, he determined the times set for them. So how long people are going to live, how long nations are going to be, when nations are going to start, when nations are going to end. He says, and the exact places where they should live. So the border, like the exact borders of each nation, the length of that nation, God did all that. God determined all that. That's the word right here in the NIV. Where's that again? He determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. That means God's doing this. God is saying, I'm doing this. Well, what has borders? What has nations and borders and the segmenting of different ethnic groups led to? That's led to wars and rumors of wars. Just think of the DMZ. That's probably the most famous border on planet Earth, the border between North Korea and South Korea. That's huge in the news today. And what happens when there's war? What happens when there's wars and rumors of wars? What happens to church attendance? And most of you, if you're old enough to remember it, I can even say that now because it was it's been 12 years ago, I guess now, but most of you will remember the Sunday right after 9/11. What happened to church attendance? Right, went way up because God determining our times and our places and everything else. That's what it leads to, and so God's ultimate purpose in everything is to draw men to Himself. That's his ultimate purpose is to gather a people for Himself, His church, and so that's God's reasons in determining governments. And I know this is a big subject. It's hard to swallow. It's sort of mind-boggling to think about. But all authority that exists comes from God, and those that exist are because of Him, and He established them and He determined them.